Good morning. This is our very first event of this weekend to celebrate Girl Scouts Love State Parks. We are so excited to be a partner with our Girl Scouts in Ohio, and we might even have some viewers from outside of Ohio, and we welcome you too. I'm Alyssa Yapel, and I'm here with my friends from the Division of Parks and Watercraft. I have Jenna Winters, and Jenna and I are going to be answering questions in the Q&A. So if you have any questions, please feel free to utilize it. And I also have with me Lauren Broderick, who is up at Maumee Bay State Park. I'm going to pass it to her in just a second so she can show us some live wildlife that we might see at Maumee Bay, which is in Northwest Ohio. But if you are a Girl Scout and joining us today, we would love it if you would say hi to us in the chat. Just let us know your name, first name is fine, and maybe the part of the state that you're from. We would love to just say hello. So I'm going to pass it to Lauren.
Hi. So again, my name is Lauren. I'm the naturalist here at Maumee Bay State Park, and we're going to kick this weekend off with a walk on the boardwalk. So I'm actually standing right outside the Nature Center here. That's the trailhead for our boardwalk, and the boardwalk shows us some really neat habitat. So what we're seeing here today is very similar to what it looked like thousands of years ago. This area actually used to be, believe it or not, covered underwater. So Lake Erie itself is a lot smaller than it historically was. So it's gone through changes. It's been big, it's been small, but thousands of years ago, this actually used to be almost completely underwater, and it was called Glacial Lake Warren. And when Glacial Lake Warren receded and got smaller and got more to the present size of Lake Erie, it left a whole bunch of clay behind. And if you guys have ever been outside, especially up here in Northwest Ohio, when it rains, you'll notice that the puddles are big and they stay around for a very long time. And that is because of our clay soil. Clay has really fine particles, and so it doesn't let the water slip through the little pieces. And with that, we get a lot of standing water. And when Glacial Lake Warren receded, it left its clay soil behind, and which left us with a swamp and a marshland. And we're seeing what used to be the remnant of the Great Black Swamp. So when you think of a swamp, you might think of water, you might think of big trees, you might think of moss. Usually it's really green and it's really mucky. Now, this area was known as the Great Black Swamp because the trees were so thick and so dense, it was really hard to maneuver, and it was also very hard to get through that mud. So the trees were in the way, and then the mud and the muck got in the way. So it was hard to settle this region. Because it was hard to settle this region, we had a lot of unique animals stay here for a lot longer. And we're going to kind of give you a snapshot of what it used to look like hundreds of years ago. So the Great Black Swamp had animals such as bears and mountain lions and wolves and foxes. And some of these animals we can still see here in the park today, but you're not going to be able to find bears and mountain lions and not even bobcats really in the park right now. So I'm going to show you a glimpse. We're walking on the boardwalk now, a glimpse of some of the things that you will see here off of the boardwalk. So behind me, you can see that kind of mucky looking water. Imagine if you're a settler coming here in the 1800s. You're trying to get to America, you want to settle down, you want to build a house. Trying to build a house in this swamp, not very easy. It was a very hard life here for the first people who came to settle this area. The native peoples didn't really use this area except in the wintertime. And you think, well, why would you really be around here in the wintertime? How would it be useful? But if you look at all of this water, think about in the middle of January and February, the weather's really, really cold. And with that, we get ice. So you can't walk around on this when it's mucky and wet, but once we get ice, it's almost like you can skate through on your feet. So they only use this area in the wintertime to hunt because they could actually finally walk through it. They had to wait for it to ice over, essentially. But the swamp may not be very good habitat for humans to live. However, it is fantastic habitat for a multitude of animals to live. So what kind of animals do you think we might find here on the boardwalk? Do you guys have any guesses? What maybe really likes to live in water? So one of our main species that we find here off of the boardwalk is actually frogs. We have 3 main types of frogs that we can find here, and I'm actually looking around for some. They have very good camouflage. But one frog that we have that is very common is called a green frog. Now, green frogs, they live up to their name. They are actually green. And they're fairly large, so they can be easy to see when they're not blending in with the duckweed and some of the other muck that you might find here at the boardwalk. Green frogs are very fun. They have an interesting call. So when you think of frogs, you might think of the traditional ribbit, 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 ribbit. However, green frogs actually sound like someone's taking a broken banjo and trying to strum it, or a really loose rubber band. They go funk, 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 funk. So if you're here walking on the boardwalk and you sounds like someone's really bad at playing the banjo, you're not hearing a bad banjo player. You're actually hearing a frog. Now, the green frogs being one of the frogs that we find here. Now, if we look down and we look at this water, you can see why they might do really well here in our marsh and swamp area. They blend in, they have fantastic camouflage, and they need that camouflage because there are plenty of things that like to eat them. So what animals might you think eat this frog? There's quite a few. When you're that small, lots of things like to eat you. One of them is actually a bird. Believe it or not, birds have a taste for frogs. It's the great blue heron. And we're going to look for those while we're walking along the way. Sometimes we can see them. They're very plentiful here in this park. Now, great blue herons are 3 feet tall. So I am 5 feet tall. So they go past my hip. So they're very big birds. They have long, long legs, and they use those long legs to be able to stand in the water because it can get pretty high here. So they use them almost as stilts. And they love to eat frogs and other animals that we find here in the marsh. Now, so frogs just don't live in the marsh. We have our green frog. We also have our American bullfrog, which can get up to 2 pounds. It is a very large frog. And they sound like a foghorn. They go, So the great blue herons like to eat those as well. And then we have our leopard frogs. Our leopard frogs live up to their name, just like the green frogs were the green color. Leopard frogs actually have spots. So they look like leopards. They have the leopard spots on them, and they use that as camouflage as well. It helps break up their body shape. So we're looking back here in the more open part of our swamp, and this is great frog habitat. And it's also great blue heron habitat because there's stuff for them to eat. However, we don't have just amphibians here or birds here. We also have snakes here. So we're surrounded by water. So what type of snake do you think we might find here in the marsh? Not a trick question. It's going to be our northern water snake. So they are found in the water, as their name may suggest, and they are a big fan of eating frogs, and they also love to eat fish too. But the difference between a swamp and kind of other wet areas is swamps and marshes typically do not have fish. They can be temporary, so some years we'll have a lot of water here, some years we'll have no water and we can completely walk back here. This year and the past few years have been an exception. We've had a ton of water, and you may notice behind me, you see a lot of dead trees. Lake Erie has been very high this year, and so with that, the trees have had a really tough time, and so they've lost their leaves early, and some of them have died because the roots have been submerged underwater for too long. But we have some plant. Yes.
Oh, hey, so we have a couple questions on frogs that I just wanted to ask you real quick. Charlotte asks, are there lily pads in the water for the frogs to sit on?
So we don't have big lily pads like you might think of, like you'll see on TV in the cartoons. However, we have a lot of aquatic plants that the frogs can sit on, but we also have a lot of brush and driftwood almost back here that the frogs like to sit on. The frogs actually kind of like to hang out in the water. I'll go try to get this camera angled correctly. They kind of like to hang out in the water, and you notice they're really good at floating, so they're excellent swimmers. But you see that really light, kind of fine green plant on top? That is called duckweed. And they like to basically hang out just under the surface. They just poke their eyes above the water so they can see what's going on. but they like to use that to help them camouflage. They typically don't like to be completely exposed, like sitting on top of a lily pad. They like to be kind of halfway in, kind of blending in, because remember, those birds might try to come eat them, and the snakes as well. So they got to be able to hide and use that camouflage to their advantage.
Okay, and then Sadie asked, now I'm not sure if you know this, Lauren, but Sadie asked, are green frogs the kinds of frogs that are usually in movies?
So the mini frogs look like the green frogs and the bullfrogs. Those two frogs can look very similar, and a lot of times when you see frogs in movies, they can be those two species. So yes.
Okay. And Jenna says she's seen leopard frogs as well.
And leopard frogs as well, yes. So the frogs we see here in the park are very, very common, that when people show them like in film, just they look, when you think of a frog, they look exactly what you would think of.
Okay, we have more questions, but I'll let you continue. We'll ask them later.
Sure, no problem. So as I said, was talking about the plants. So some of the trees had a really hard time, but there are other plants that didn't. So this is actually one of my favorite plants behind me, and we're going to get a little closer look when we go down the way as well. This is called buttonbush. It is, I think, a very cute plant. They have flowers that look like white pom-poms, and they're one of the early blooming flowers here at Maumee Bay State Park. So us being by the lake, by Lake Erie, it is a great lake. She is a very large lake, and she can kind of control the weather here. So it takes us longer here to get cold in the fall and winter time because Lake Erie's waters are still warm. But once she gets cold, it stays cold here a lot longer. So here in May, it's still in the 40s and maybe 50s if we're lucky at the beginning of May. And so sometimes the plants are delayed in blooming, but the buttonbush, they can tolerate the cold. And they can tolerate the standing water, and they bloom fairly early on. And so our insects just emerging out of their winter hibernation are looking for food. They're very, very hungry. And with that, they use our buttonbush. We actually have, I see some buttonbush flowers that hopefully you guys can see from here. I'm gonna turn it around. Go this way. So I don't know if you guys can see it. I have a glare on my screen. Can you see those fluffy white flowers in the background?
It's hard, kind of hard to see.
I'll hopefully get a better view of them as we go on. But they look like big white pom-poms. They're adorable little flowers, and it's a very neat, well-adapted plant to the swamp and marsh area. And I can show you what their seeds look like. So they have pom-pom flowers. And with that, we get, let me set this up real fast. Sorry, don't want to give you guys. So these are their seed heads. So their flowers are round, and then they get these nice round seeds. So just imagine these seed heads covered in white fluffy flowers. They are quite adorable, and they're really important for our early insect pollinators. Go nice and slow. Sorry, I don't want to give you guys motion sickness. So as we're getting farther in the more dense woods, we have some other animals that like the more heavily wooded area. So when I mentioned birds, I mentioned the great blue heron, but remember those birds are fairly big. So imagine if you were a 3-foot tall bird with about a 6-foot wingspan trying to get through all these trees. It'd be kind of difficult. You'd be knocking your wings. So the great blue herons prefer the more open areas, but we also have some predatory birds that like to hang out in the denser trees. So even though we're in a marsh, you're thinking, well, what predatory birds besides the herons are really going to be found here? Believe it or not, we actually have hawks that specialize in this area, and also hawks that specialize in the more heavily wooded area. So these dense woods would be an issue for many hawks that fly through, but we have some more woodland hawks. So we have Cooper's hawks, which breed here in the park, and they like to eat smaller birds and smaller mammals. So they actually nest in these trees, and they have very specialized shaped wings that they can maneuver through the trees. They can zigzag and not run into them like some of the larger birds may. So the Cooper's hawks are able to hunt in these dense trees. So it's very neat to get to see them breed here as well as hunt here. So I mentioned we have the hawks, and I mentioned that they eat other birds. This area in particular is known for the warbler migration. So what are warblers? It's kind of a funny name for a bird. Well, they're named after their call. Their call is warbling, so it kind of sounds like a musical trickle. And the warblers are neotropical, which is a very long word to say that they come from Central South, the tropical region, so Central South in America and Mexico, and they stay down there in the wintertime, and then come spring, they move all the way back up here to breed. And we are super lucky here because remember the big Great Lake Erie? She is basically a freshwater ocean that these birds have to cross. So when they're flying thousands upon thousands and thousands of miles, they need a lot of fuel to get that far because these birds weigh as much as a pencil. So imagine you weigh as much as a pencil and you're having to fly thousands of miles to get to where you need to go in the summertime. So, and then you come across a giant lake that has winds that can be very hard to deal with. So what do you have to do? You got to go eat. And so come May here, the first and second week of May is usually when we have our big migrations. The warblers all get forced here in Northwest Ohio and they have to fuel up before they can fly over Lake Erie. So we have 2 weeks of birds that are trying to stuff their faces as fast as they can before they fly over that lake, which means we have excellent bird viewing here in the park. And warblers are beautiful birds. They are multiple colors. They can be reds, they can have yellows, they can have oranges, there's even one called a black-throated blue warbler, which is a shiny dark deep blue and it has white belly and black on its face. They're gorgeous looking birds. They almost look like someone went and painted the birds with they were very, very creative and wanted to use all of their colors. So it's very neat to see them here. And they only are about the size of they're actually smaller than my fist. So these are tiny, brightly colored birds that all come here at once. And it's a very neat to see here in spring. It kind of is the hallmark letting us know winter is finally going away. Our birds are here because the conditions are right. So that's one thing you can see here in the park. And the boardwalk in particular is what most people use to see them. Now, our boardwalk here at Maumee Bay State Park is really nice. It is ADA accessible, so it means that anybody can use it. So if you're in a wheelchair or you have other conditions that you might need a more flat surface, this is perfect for you. And it is almost 2 miles long, so you get to see this beautiful lake view and the beautiful marsh and swamp view for 2 miles. It's flat, it's easy to move. So you might get views like this where you see, remember what this plant is called? This is duckweed. And I hear an angry great blue heron. Hopefully we'll get to see him up ahead. Duckweed. So this is excellent camouflage if you're a frog. And even if you're a snake, you want to blend in because remember, the snakes have to be able to capture the frogs. And the snakes also have predators themselves. And you also get evidence of predators. Yes.
Oh, sorry to interrupt, but we have a couple questions about the boardwalk. And so while you were touching on it, I just wanted to ask. Somebody had asked, now I'm not sure if you were around when the boardwalk was built, but how long did it take to build the boardwalk? And do you happen to know how many people it took to build it?
It took quite a few people. So we were very fortunate here that it was the Conservation Corps, the CCC, helped build this boardwalk. And they actually started it in the fall. So imagine trying to get through the marsh here as it gets colder, because it's too mucky to do it in the spring and summer. So they had to wait till fall. So not only was it cold, they were in mucky weather and it took them quite some time. It actually took almost 2,000 pounds of nails for them all the nails here in the boardwalk. So it is a lot, and they lost some of them in the marsh just because of the conditions, but it took them quite a while. Kara, do you know exactly how long it took them? It took them at least 6 months, but I believe it took them longer, but they worked very, very hard, and it actually opened the grand opening was in 1993. I believe they started in the fall of 92 and they opened it in the fall of 93. So it took at least 6 months, if not a year. But it was a very, very long process. It is not easy to deal with these marshy conditions, and it kind of gave them a snapshot of how it was to live here as a settler. So with this water here, it's hard to deal with. So they had to kind of figure out how it was when the first people came over here to try to settle the region.
And we have a couple girls that have asked, Charlotte and Addison have asked, how deep is the swamp? And I know I saw somebody ask, how wide is the swamp?
So the Great Black Swamp, when it was in its full existence, the Great Black Swamp actually used to be 40 miles wide and 120 miles long. So the swamp used to be huge. Here at Maumee Bay State Park, our park is almost 2,000 acres, and less than half of that is the current swamp itself. So the swamp itself here, it can vary in depth seasonally. So some years we have 3 or 4 feet of water, other years we have no water. And it also depends on the area. So the area where we're standing here is probably about 2 feet deep right now. However, if we have northeast winds, so winds coming from basically Canada and blowing towards us, those winds can actually shift Lake Erie's water over on this side of the Western Basin. And with that, Lake Erie's water can rise up to 10 feet with depending on how high those winds are. And that water all comes back here in the marsh. We've actually had water over almost to the top of this railing here because we had so much flooding from the Lake Erie and the winds, the northeast winds. So it can vary greatly, but in a typical summer, if we've had a relatively wet year, you're looking probably an average of 1.5 feet to 2 feet of water in the deeper parts. So we're talking about the different birds here, so the warblers and how great it is for viewing, but we're pretty fortunate here in the park that we have a lot of animals to view year round. So not only do we have the warblers and the migration in the spring, we have a variety of animals that stick around year round. So imagine being here in the wintertime. Lake Erie can be kind of harsh. The winds blowing off the lake, off that ice, makes it very, very cold. And when you're in a swamp, the water's frozen. So you don't have a lot of habitat. You can't go underwater anymore because it's ice, or if you're underwater, you stay underwater. So it can be very hard to live here in the wintertime, but the animals that are here year-round are adapted to this type of weather and this type of habitat to deal with it. So a lot of mammals stick here year-round, and then actually, believe it or not, a lot of birds. So the birds that we find here year-round are one of our feeder favorites. You usually see them. They come visit our feeder here at the Nature Center, but they're able to find food here in the marsh, even though you might think it'd be a lot harder than it is for them depending on the year. So our state bird, the northern cardinal, is here year-round. The chickadee, which is one of my favorites, we have the black-capped chickadees this far north. They stay here year-round, and they're actually cavity nesters, so they use the holes in the trees to hang out in the wintertime as they're having to deal with the cold weather. We also have a variety of woodpeckers that stay here, and actually one of our winter visitors is letting himself known, the bird that you heard, that that was a blue jay. We can find those here in the winter. And what's unique about the blue jays that we see here in the winter, they're actually Canadian blue jays. So blue jays it's like local migration, so it's short migration. So the blue jays up here at Maumee Bay State Park might go to southern Ohio, while the Canadian blue jays were like, we just need it a little bit warmer, and they'll come down and visit us. So we'll get blue jays, we'll get mourning doves, we'll have red-bellied woodpeckers, downy woodpeckers, hairy woodpeckers, all here in the park as well. And we also get some birds that specifically come here just in the wintertime. So you think, why would you come here in the wintertime? Because they're coming from northern Canada, the Canadian tundra. So we have the dark-eyed juncos, which are absolutely adorable. They look like they're wearing little tuxedos and they're small and sparrow sized. We have a crowd favorite that visits us here in the winter, the snowy owl. So they are a bird of the tundra, and a tundra has no trees. It is too cold. The soil has permafrost, so basically the soil is almost frozen all the time. So it can't support trees. And with that, that means the owl really likes our open areas that we have here, and they love the beach. So where else can you go and see an owl hanging out at the beach but here in the wintertime? So this is very popular for some birders in the wintertime because there's plenty to see here, believe it or not. We get raccoons that stay here year-round. Our white-tailed deer are here year-round, and I actually have some raccoon evidence. So one of our things that we do here in the winter to identify animals is tracking. And one of the things that we track besides footprints is scat. So scat is animal poop, and I actually have some raccoon poop to show you. That's how we know. You can see those black blobs on the sides. Of the boardwalk, that's raccoon scat. So we definitely have raccoons here in the park. They often eat berries, and you'll see different things in their poop that we know for sure that they're raccoons. So that's one thing you can do in the wintertime is identify animals with their feet, their footprints, and also with their poop. So behind me, I'll see if we get a good view of Lake Erie. It might be a little tricky today with the leaves still out. So directly behind me, behind that last tree line there is Lake Erie. So we are right up against Lake Erie. And so remember when I said when we have a lot of winds, it floods back here, and that's because we are basically at the shore of Lake Erie. So strong winds, the water rises, it all comes back here in the marsh, which means we're greatly affected. So imagine being a settler here in the region. Not only do you have to deal with the cold winter, you have to deal with the changing water levels, but what else might you think you can find animal-wise here in the marsh? Mosquitoes. Remember how I said the water is standing? Lots of mosquitoes are here. Thankfully, we're very fortunate we have a good bat population to eat those mosquitoes. But even with a good bat population, the settlers used to have issues with the mosquitoes. You'd think that the bears and the mountain lions and the wolves might be the biggest threat. It was actually the mosquitoes. Mosquitoes can carry diseases, and one of the big issues that they had here was malaria. So the mosquitoes would bite the people that lived here. They would get sick with malaria, and they actually used to think that it was the swamp gases, the swamp fumes that were causing that sickness. And the whole entire time, it was actually the malaria. So it was tough to live here in Northwest Ohio. Now, this region has changed greatly. So we're looking at what looks like very, very swamping. You hear all the insects. You see how the ground is dark. Remember the Great Black Swamp? The trees were dense and the soil was dark. So that's how it got the name Great Black Swamp. It was a big swamp and very dark soil, very dark to be back here. And so you think, the bears would be the issues. The wolves would be the issues. The mountain lions would be the issues. It's actually the malaria that they had to deal with. And it was hard to settle here in this region due to it just being difficult to build houses and difficult to find food and difficult to deal with just the general muck. It was hard to do transportation. It could take days just to go to a few miles if you're trying to get a horse through this muck. And the heyday of the Great Black Swamp, when they were first settling here, the horses would sink down to their bellies. The muck and mud was so thick. So it was a hard area to deal with. And so the Great Black Swamp used to be 40 miles wide, 120 miles long. People would actually go out of their way. They would go through Lake Erie rather than try to go straight across the Great Black Swamp. They'd go hundreds of miles out of their way just to avoid this region. And it wasn't until Toledo was settled and became really a true town that we started to get more people in this area. And for it to be easier for more people to settle this area, a big thing here was ditches. So the ditches actually drained the swamp and completely changed the landscape. So now you come here into Northwest Ohio and you'll notice it's a lot of farmland, lots of farmland. Remember that clay soil, how it holds all the water? It also holds a ton of nutrients. So this was a very fertile soil. So the people who toughed it out and were able to live here and have dry enough land and able to build ditches were able to have some fantastic agriculture. But with the change of the land and the loss of the Great Black Swamp, it also changed Lake Erie. So you think Great Black Swamp, gross, mucky, icky, filled with mosquitoes. How is it useful? It acts as a filter. Wetlands acts as filters and sponges for our watersheds. So it's basically the last filter, the last line of defense before whatever is going to go into Lake Erie can get there. So with the Great Black Swamp, all the sediments were no longer trapped because there wasn't a swamp anymore. All the trees were cut down. There was ditches that ran directly into the watershed, into the lake. And so that changed. Lake Erie used to be crystal clear. And so now we have a lot more turbid, a lot darker, a lot more sediment-filled lake. And with the loss of our swamp, we ended up encountering issues with the lake itself and the water quality. So that's something to keep in mind, that wetlands, even though they might not appear that they're very useful to people, they are incredibly useful, because what is Lake Erie but our drinking water? So We all want to have clean drinking water. And so we need to remember that we need to protect our wetlands because they're actually very important, even though they might seem like they're icky or yucky or filled with mosquitoes. They're very, very important. And we have a great blue heron. He's preening himself. Let's see if I can get a good view of him. I don't know if you guys can see him. He's back there in the marsh. He's pretty far back. He's going to be that gray blob that you see moving in the back there. And remember how I said he's 3 feet tall? He's actually a very, very efficient predator. He eats frogs, he eats snakes. They can even eat small mammals such as squirrels. And one of our other small mammals that we have here in the marsh are muskrat. So we've had some flooding. So a lot of our muskrat dens have been pushed out of the way because of the floods. But let me see if we have any remnant ones over here. So muskrats are rodents. They look like rats. They have a long kind of rat-like tail that they use to swim, but they're aquatic rodents. So they actually hang out. They like to eat vegetation, and they hang out and they make dens. They make lodges out of grasses. So you may notice all of this grass behind me. So this area has some native grasses, but a big issue with the changing landscape is we have invasive species that we encounter. So the plants behind me is actually an invasive species called Phragmites. Phragmites is not native to North America. This particular species of Phragmites is not native to North America. And as you can see, it forms dense, impenetrable stands. So because there's so much of it, it doesn't allow the native species to be here. It basically chokes them out. It gets all the sunlight, it gets all the nutrients, and no native plants can grow in. And the Phragmites is not a very useful plant for a lot of our native wildlife. Our native wildlife is adapted to eating certain plants. It's adapted to using plants a certain way. And with that, the Phragmites is not the plant that they are used to. So it doesn't make good habitat, and unfortunately can affect some of our native populations of animals here. And the problem with Phragmites is it's very difficult to get rid of. One of the big issues here is it's growing in the marsh, but it's best controlled by fire. And it is very difficult to do control of it because it's hard to set a marsh on fire. And when our marsh is finally dry enough to deal with it, we have our boardwalk made of wood. So that's one of our issues here we have for controlling the Phragmites. We are actually working on a grant. It's called the SWIFT grant, and it's going to allow us to control the water level here and the marsh. So when Lake Erie is feet above average, we are not going to be flooded with water. We're going to be able to control how much water can come back here, which means we can actually lower the water here in the swamp, and we can lower the water enough that we can control this without having to worry about losing our boardwalk to a controlled burn. And we have a frog. He's going to be a little bit difficult to see. So if you look at that stump, and there's another smaller stump, he's the bigger green blob in the middle. Let's see if I can see him on the screen so I can point him out. He's going to be right about there. That looks like a very green bullfrog. So bullfrogs can also be quite green. They're going to be a little bit bigger, and the green frogs tend to have a more bicolor look to them. But the easiest way to tell the difference between a green frog and a bullfrog from a distance, if they're calling, they have a completely different sound. Remember, the green frog goes funk, 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 and the bullfrog goes hoo, hoo, hoo. So here's a closer view of our Phragmites. But our Phragmites, as I mentioned, grows in dense stands and can be very difficult, but it is also, not fall into the swamp, it's also wind dispersed. So here's this seed head. And remember how I mentioned that it's very windy here at the lake? So we have a lot of wind, and if this is a wind dispersed species, it means this stuff spreads everywhere. So it's very hard to control because once we get it out of one area, it basically is repopulated from another. So we can completely remove it from the park. However, it has invaded all of the outlying areas and all of the wet low-lying areas in this part of the state, and most of Ohio. So we can remove it from one area, but we can't remove it from everywhere, and so we get reinfected from outside sources. So controlling invasive species can be very, very difficult. Speaking of invasive species, this wooded area, this swampy area, used to be populated by ash trees. And in 2008, the emerald ash borer invaded, essentially, it came in through Detroit. So we were one of the first areas hit by the emerald ash borer. And they live up to their name as well. They bore into ash trees, and eventually it kills the trees. So we had lost almost all of our ash trees back here. And so we had different trees come in, and we had scrub come in, and it changed the landscape of this marsh as well. So invasive species can have a huge impact as a domino effect of what it can do to the native animals here.
Hey, Lauren.
Yes.
So we have quite a few questions, and Ella and Maya from Northeast Ohio had asked, what trees are there? So, well, you touched on the ash. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So here in the marsh, the composition of the trees here are maple trees. We have red maple trees and silver maple trees. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, that we saw a lot of dead trees back here. We've had extensive flooding. It's been basically inundated with water for over 2 years. It hasn't dried out at all. Usually in the summer, it dries out back here. And with that, we've lost a lot of our maple trees. Our maple trees like water, but they don't like to be underwater. So we do have some left in the higher areas, but right now we have lost a lot of our maples. However, we do have cottonwood trees and sycamore trees that do very well back here, as well as the rough-leaf dogwood. The rough-leaf dogwood is like emergent growth tree. It doesn't get huge, but it is actually kind of scrubby, but it's really important for native wildlife because they have berries. So a lot of our birds like to eat berries, especially in the wintertime, because there's no bugs. All the bugs, it's too cold for the bugs to be out. So that's a very important food source for our native birds in particular. So the cottonwood, the sycamore, the rough leaf dogwood, as well as our silver and red maple trees are the composition of most of the forest here.
Okay. Do you mind if I ask a few more questions? Because I want to try and answer them. Before we run out of time. So I have a lot of folks that have asked about deer and beavers. Sydney from PA asked, are there beavers and ducks? Olivia and Sophia, also from PA, asked about beavers. So I'll let you answer that, and then I'll move on.
Sure. So we actually do have beavers in the park. At one point, we did not. Beavers were actually threatened. Were a species. They are basically almost gone in this region. And beavers actually have an interesting history. So you were a settler here in the swamp. It is cold. It is wet. It is windy here in the wintertime. And beavers are semi-aquatic rodents. So they have specialized fur that basically they have like an oil that allows them to be water resistant. So the water kind of rolls off of them. And so they were very important to the settlers here because they were using them as clothing. It helped keep them warm because the beavers are active year round here. So they got to deal with the cold water. They got to deal with the cold winter. And they have to also be able to deal with the wet. So beaver pelts were super important. They're almost currency. They're essentially currency here to the settlers. So beavers were overhunted and basically had declined in population in this section, but now they are back. Their population numbers are doing a lot better, and we actually do have beavers here on the eastern side of the park. And sycamore trees and cottonwood trees and poplar trees are some of their favorite trees to eat, and we've actually seen evidence in the east side of the park where they have gnawed, and they do that typical hourglass-shaped gnawing of the trees. So we definitely have beaver here, and we also have their smaller cousin, the muskrat. A lot of people see muskrat and they think they're beavers. Beavers are the size of a small dog. They can get like 35 pounds, so they are much bigger than you expect. So if you see an animal here at the park that's the size of a football that's in the water, that's going to be our muskrat. If you see the animal in the park that's the size of a medium-sized dog in the water, that's going to be our beaver. So yes, we do have beavers in the park. We also have ducks in the park. One of the big populations of waterfowl that we have is the Canada goose. Now, so they're not Canadian geese, they're Canada geese. So they can be Canadian Canada geese, but Canada geese is their proper name. And we do have Canadian Canada geese because we are right by Canada. So we do definitely get some Canadian ones. But Canada geese are very popular here. They like open fields, and we have a golf course here at the park, so they like to graze at the golf course. And then we have our marsh and the lake right next to it, so they have a lot of really good habitat. They can be an issue of overpopulation. They do really well around people. And they like human habitat. So with that, we get an overabundance occasionally of Canada geese. Canada geese can be so prolific that they can actually cause water quality problems in our inland lake. So we definitely have waterfowl here. We also have an abundance of teal in the fall. So we have blue-winged teal and green-winged teal here in the fall, as well as we have mallard ducks. And then we get, it's really neat in the wintertime, in early spring, we actually get migratory ducks coming through here. We get diving ducks and paddling ducks. So the mallards are the paddlers. They like to sit on the surface. They don't dive under for food. They kind of just stick their heads under and get what they can. And then we have our fish-eating diving ducks, such as the merganser, which they have a kind of silly looking beak. It's a lot more pointed than what you would think of a duck. And we have our golden eyes. We have our buffalo heads. So we get quite a variety of very, very colorful ducks here in the park. And then I know we had a question about deer. We have a ton of deer here in the park. I have counted in one sitting, I've seen 49 deer at one time. All in one herd was my record. But here, even in the marsh, believe it or not, the marsh is actually kind of a haven for the deer. Humans can't get as close to them because there's water and you're restricted to the boardwalk. And a lot of times when the water level isn't as high, the does will drop their fawns. They'll actually have their babies here in the park, here in the marsh. So we have plenty of deer here. And then we also get the males, the bucks, that we've had a 14-point buck here hanging out behind the boardwalk. So they're best to see actually in the fall and winter time when there's no leaves on the trees. They're a lot easier to pick out and see. So yes, to answer your question, we do have ducks, we do have deer.
Okay, and Meredith from South Carolina also asked about turtles, and Maddie asked about rodents. I know you talked about muskrats, Lauren, but are there other rodents? And
yes, absolutely. Okay, so turtles. We actually have a species that is threatened and concerned here in Ohio. We have the Blandings turtle. They are my absolute favorite. They are so adorable. They're an aquatic species of turtle, and they actually have a hinged shell. So if you guys check out our webinar later on today at noon, we'll be talking a little bit more about our Blandings turtle and the hinged shells of turtles. But they have a hinged shell, so they can kind of close up their shell, like when you see in a cartoon when the turtle completely closes up. The Blandings can similarly close up. They can't do it all the way, but they can do pretty close. So the Blandings turtle is here in the park, and they actually have a bright yellow neck, and it makes the yellow goes up on their mouth, and it makes it look like they're smiling all the time. So they're my smiley turtles. Another very common turtle here is the Midland painted turtle. They cannot close their shells up, but they are excellent swimmers. They are very common here. You'll often see them doing turtle ballet on the logs as they're sunning themselves to keep warm. And then our common snapping turtle. Those are the three most common species of turtle, with the Midland painted and the snapping turtle being the most common. And we also have a multitude of snakes. So I mentioned the water snake. We also have garter snakes here in the park. We have our eastern garter, which comes in actually two different colors. More colors than that, but the colors that we see here in the park are the typical wild type brown. And then we have a melanistic population. So when you think of melanistic, so if you know what albino is, it means that they're all white, doesn't have any color essentially to them. Melanistic is the exact opposite. So they have more melanin than normal, so they end up being almost jet black. So they're very neat to be able to see that here. They're about 50% of our garter snake population is melanistic. So you really can't go anywhere else and see that high of a ratio rather easily. So we're lucky up here. And then we have our absolute favorite snake, which is a Northwest specialty. It is the eastern fox snake, and you can actually only find them on the western basin of Lake Erie. So you can only find them on this side of Ohio, and they get their name fox snake because They smell like foxes, and if you know what foxes smell like, it means they smell like skunk. But I guess skunk snake didn't have quite the ring to it, so they went with fox snake. So we have those here. They're excellent swimmers, and they're really good climbers. So we have lots of different. And then rodents-wise, we do have, so the main rodents you're going to see are going to be our muskrat, but we also have squirrels. So squirrels are in the rodent family. We have the most common squirrel that you're going to find here is going to be the eastern fox squirrel. And the eastern fox squirrels, they are rather large, and it's really neat in the wintertime. They get chunky. They do really well. They have to basically bulk up for the wintertime. And so they eat as much food as they possibly can, and they get almost double the size. So we have very chunky squirrels here in the wintertime, and they stay active year round. So they're eating those nuts from the white oak trees and the swamp oak trees that we have, and then they're eating the acorns from those, and then any fruits or nuts they can find to make do in the wintertime.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, and I have probably about 5 questions for you.
Sure.
So
we'll go ahead and get through these questions.
Yeah, so Remy, Ella, and Lisa asked about fox. Do you have fox there? And Caitlin asked about eagles. I think I saw somebody else ask about eagles and flowers besides the white ones. So I don't know.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. So we have a variety of wildlife here at Maumee Bay. So we absolutely have eagles. Now we don't have any that are currently breeding here in the park, but all around the park, we have plenty of eagles. If you go down to the end of the boardwalk, there's an observation tower, and that's actually the best spot to see eagles flying over the lake. So you definitely can see them here. We see them almost in the springtime. It's almost every day I'll see an eagle here. And in terms of flowers, we actually have a variety of flowers here. We have orchids that bloom here in the park. The orchids are very small. They're kind of hard to see. They're off the boardwalk, but we have orchids. We also have the swamp mallow, or the swamp mallow or marshmallow. It's in the hibiscus family, so it's related to the tropical hibiscus. They're big pink flowers the size of my head. We have wingstem here, which is a yellow plant that blooms here in late fall, and then we have our trees that also bloom. So we have our dogwoods that have white flowers, our crab apples and that can have pinkish flowers. So we definitely have a lot of different blooms here in the fall as well, and spring as well. And then what was the other question? I'm sorry.
Oh shoot, what was it? Well, we covered fox.
Foxes.
Eagles,
that was one
flowers.
I didn't get.
Okay.
So foxes. So we do have foxes here in the park. The red fox is the one that's going to be primarily that we can find here. So the red fox, is actually more common. It used to be even more common here in the park. However, with the expansion of coyotes, they actually outcompete the foxes. So we don't have quite as many red foxes as we used to, but we definitely have them in the park. And I have been scared by one, because if you guys have ever heard a fox call sounds like a lady screaming in the woods, and they usually do it at night, and I heard one screaming at night, and it definitely scared me, and then I had to think, I'm like, oh yeah, that's a fox. But we have them in the park as well as coyotes.
Okay, and 2 more minutes, so quick. I have 3 more questions. Let's see. Sasha asked, are there any animals with poison?
Okay, so we do have, so the difference between venomous and poisonous. So a venomous animal has to bite or sting you to make you sick, and a poisonous animal you have to touch or eat it. So the poisonous animals we have in this park are actually monarch butterflies. So don't eat monarch butterflies, they'll make you sick. The American toad also has poison in it. It makes them taste bad and cause an upset stomach, so don't eat any of our toads, and wash your hands after picking one up. The venomous animals we have, believe it or not, so all of our wasps and bees are all venomous, and we have geese that are commenting overhead, you can hear them. But the garter snakes actually have the venom that works against amphibians. So it's not venom that can hurt people, but it's venom that can hurt amphibians. It helps them overpower them.
Okay. And Grace Lynn asked, why is it called Maumee Bay State Park?
It's named after the Maumee River.
Okay.
So, yep, that's how we got our name. The Maumee River dumps into Lake Erie, and then hence we're the bay of the Maumee River in Lake Erie.
Okay. And last, we tried to get to everyone's questions. I hope that we answered them in some way. But last but not least, somebody asked, what is a swamp? So we talked a lot about swamps today, but can you give a quick overview?
I sure can. So a swamp is an area that has a wetland that has trees, essentially. That's going to be the big difference between a marsh. A marsh is a wetland that has grasses versus a swamp that can have trees. So the basic is if it has trees, it's probably a swamp.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much, Lauren. Thanks to all of our viewers. It is time for us to go and get ready for our next episode, which is about crawdads. So I hope to see you all then. But thank you, Lauren and Kara, who's behind the camera, for helping us with this awesome tour of Maumee Bay State Park and the Boardwalk. Bye.
Thanks, guys. See you later. Bye.